Many people have heard of the word apartheid, and most know the meaning of the word or what it stands for. There are a lot of debates surrounding the word and the policy it represented in South Africa between 1948 and 1994. In this regard, most people would agree that the policy of apartheid was generally bad insofar as its political context is concerned. However, few people know or understand that the ills of apartheid went beyond the common political context and reached ethical, moral and psychological dimensions. This is perhaps the most damaging effect of that system, as its effects have outlived its political existence. Those who were alive before 1994 and remain alive today fail to fully fathom the problems existing in modern-day South Africa as having their origins in apartheid because of the patent classification of the system politically. They often attribute the country's failures to political divisions and fail to consider the unspoken underlying causes of such failures, yet they are arguably the main catalysts of economic, political and social problems in South Africa today. As a political policy, apartheid was adopted by the National Party in 1948 in South Africa, then known as the Union of South Africa. At the time, the country, which had unified the two Boer republics, i.e. the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, as well as the two British republics, i.e. the Cape Colony and Natal in 1910, remained under the rulership of the British Crown. Led by Dr. D.F. Malan, the National Party announced to the world that it would actively pursue and implement the policy of apartheid for the inhabitants of South Africa. The word, apartheid, is derived from Dutch, the language spoken by the descendants of white settlers of present-day South Africa, who came from Holland or the Netherlands to South Africa in 1652. It literally means separateness or apartness. After its adoption as official government policy in 1948, white Afrikaner nationalists actively pursued the segregation of South Africa's four principal racial groups: Black South Africans, also referred to as Africans or natives, Indians, colored people, that is, those of mixed racial heritage, and whites. Therefore, between 1948 and 1994, race relations were structured in a hierarchical order, with the white race occupying the top, followed by Indians or Asians, then colored, and the blacks or natives at the bottom. This hierarchical arrangement also spoke to degrees of importance in several aspects of life, including education, economic activities and even social relations. Since the demographic composition of South Africa places the natives as the majority, such policy attracted a lot of pushback or resistance from the black population. Thus, no sooner had the policy of apartheid been introduced to the world, than it faced immediate opposition. Soon, protest marches and acts of civil disobedience against discriminatory laws became common, with the government responding with greater degrees of repression. The methods of resistance to the government in Pretoria between 1948 and 1961 by non-white races opposed to apartheid were generally known as passive resistance. Many of the resistance programs that were implemented during that time had been sanctioned by leaders of black African political organizations, particularly the African National Congress, ANC, and the South African Communist Party, SACP. One of the notable leaders of these organizations was a young man called Nelson Mandela, who worked with other anti-apartheid activists such as Ahmed Kathrada, Andrew Mlangeni, Govan Mbeki, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and others. Nevertheless, successive administrations to Dr. Malan remained as equally resolute in making apartheid work as the natives were in bringing the system to an end. Vast resources were spent on making the apartheid system work, especially from 1959, where Bantustans, i.e. black homelands, were officially created under Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd's premiership. However, such reforms could not work without enabling legislative instruments. In that regard, several pieces of legislation were enacted regulating every aspect of life in South Africa, including education, religion, marriage, social gatherings, and the use of public facilities, amongst other things. Needless to say, non-whites bore the brunt of the government's segregationist policies. Several Africans and Indians were arrested and imprisoned in jails for acts of civil disobedience. In some instances, some lost their lives in the hands of the police. And so the implementation of the idea of apartheid began and gained traction, with much reference to it by the government of the time as separate development and justified as such. In late March 1960, following the shooting of unarmed civilians at a place known as Sharpeville near Johannesburg, the strategy of passive resistance to the repression of apartheid was abandoned. Militant methods were employed instead, especially after the banning of the ANC and the SACP, and the subsequent imprisonment of their leaders on Robben Island, and Alcatraz off the coast of Cape Town. Throughout the 1960s and especially in the 1970s, the forms of resistance against apartheid took on a radical outlook with ever-increasing repression from Pretoria in response. In the 1980s, partly due to international sanctions, increased calls for the release of political prisoners and the high levels of lawlessness, the government viewed negotiations as the most viable solution to the political deadlock in the country. By 1990, most political prisoners had been released, especially Nelson Mandela, and negotiations for a democratic South Africa based on equal rights began in earnest. The 27th of April 1994 was heralded as a new beginning for the country. It was the day in which the first multi-racial elections were held in South Africa and a black government took residence at the Union Buildings in Pretoria. However, whilst all looked rosy from a political perspective, the pre-1994 negotiators failed to appreciate the extent of the problem they would inherit in the post-1994 era. This problem related to the extent of the damage the apartheid system had done on the oppressed people of South Africa. Although the problem may have had its origin in politics, it nonetheless ran deeper than that. Politics was therefore just the tip of the iceberg. The scars of apartheid, especially on the black South African population, and to some extent black South African women, ran deep. They continue to do so even today and can be classified under several factors including economic, ethical, moral, psychological and social factors which often overlap with each other. As already pointed out, the apartheid structure was created to benefit white South Africans to the exclusion of other races, especially black Africans. Black Africans were relegated to extractive models of the economy that would propagate the apartheid system, as well as guarantee the white man's comfort. In that regard, many men were compelled to abandon their families in the Bantustans or black homelands for Johannesburg to work in mines. Women on the other hand were compelled to work in nearby urban centers as domestic workers and nannies, and would return home in time to be with children before the curfews set in. Thus, seldom would men return home to be with their families as the government had created amenities in their work areas. Moreover, the requirement for carrying passbooks, that is, the degrading identity documents black South Africans were compelled to carry by law, made traveling cumbersome between Union and later Republican areas of South Africa, as well as between the Bantustans. Therefore, most men opted to begin life anew where they worked, in settlements that the apartheid government carefully planned, known as townships. The type of accommodation created by the apartheid government where black South African migrant laborers dwelled was commonly referred to as hostels. Hostels were usually not fit for human habitation as many miners were crammed into confined spaces, with few ablution facilities. Nevertheless, life had to continue as per the system's requirements. If ever men traversed the country to their homelands which were several hundred kilometers away, they were often greeted by a distorted family set-up. Their erstwhile wives would have obtained new suitors and even started new families altogether, especially with men who worked as gardeners or performed other forms of manual labor for whites in urban areas. Consequently, many black South African children were raised without their biological fathers, who were deprived of the chance to instill ethical values, that is, the moral compass that shapes behavior by distinguishing right from wrong. This cycle repeated itself during the 46 years of apartheid and unfortunately continues to manifest even to this day, a few decades after the end of apartheid. The next barrier to black South Africans' development was education. The Department of Bantu Education prevented the ascension of black South Africans to high levels of education. Under the Bantu Education Act 1953, black South Africans had to be deliberately taught subjects that made them occupy low-tier professions in the future which benefited white South Africans. Thus, subjects like mathematics and science were deemed by the Minister of Bantu Affairs, as he was called, as unnecessary for them. Yet, education could have served as a powerful means of shaping the outlook of communities affected by fractured family structures. It might have offered a pathway to move beyond domestic hardship by fostering a sense of hope in otherwise difficult circumstances. Furthermore, apartheid segregation extended to religion also, with races forbidden to worship in same places of worship. The irony of it was that religion is by definition non-partisan. This was the third barrier. Although it was prohibited, many churches, particularly in a predominantly Christian South Africa, were used as platforms for political resistance against the apartheid system. The few clergymen who dared speak out often found themselves at loggerheads with the security forces. Nevertheless, notable clergymen like Bishop Desmond Tutu of the Anglican Church spoke vehemently against the injustices of apartheid and gained support in so doing. Since interracial social integration was prohibited under apartheid, many Africans had little opportunity to engage in meaningful interaction with people of other races, limiting their exposure to diverse perspectives that might have shaped their broader outlook on life. This was the fourth barrier. Public spaces and social amenities, such as cinemas and parks, as well as public transport systems, were segregated by race, and access to information from the media and books was tightly controlled. Unfortunately, it was against this existential backdrop that future South African leaders were quote-unquote, groomed. As a result, frustration and anger set in among the black population, especially the youth. Those who resolved to be selfless joined the anti-apartheid guerrillas in neighboring countries, whilst those who resigned to their fate and remained in South Africa, directed their frustrations to government property through unbridled acts of violence. Images of violence in South Africa were often beamed across the globe between 1948 and 1994. The destruction of infrastructure, both government and private-owned, was a consequence of such anger and frustrations. Sadly, this destructive culture continues even today. Although politics was the primary catalyst for anti-apartheid violence, much of the violence can be attributed to one factor, that is, frustrations emanating from broken family structures. After all, the home is the most important societal unit from which all else flows. Today, many black South African families exist under such social conditions, with many children being raised by uncles, aunts and grandparents, many of whom have little to no education. It is from such family setups that post-1994 politicians emanate, unfortunately, whose political ideologies are shaped by resentment and anger towards their compatriots. Thus, the 1994 miracle, as it is sometimes referred to, came in the midst of several unresolved societal issues. Whether the post-apartheid government was oblivious to such societal problems or was simply overwhelmed by its new responsibilities, remains moot. Nevertheless, the problems remain today, and they seem to get worse. To better understand this, it is useful to consider the apartheid timeline. A black individual born in 1948, at the onset of apartheid, would have been 46 years old in 1994 and thus part of the pool of potential future leaders shaped entirely by that system. By 1994, the generation of Nelson Mandela had aged and, after long periods of imprisonment, was less able to govern the new South Africa as effectively as hoped, having been largely removed from both domestic developments and global affairs. In this context, it would have been unrealistic to expect Nelson Mandela's generation to manage a modern state using perspectives formed in the 1950s and 1960s. It is therefore unsurprising that leadership was eventually passed on to a younger generation of candidates by 1999. However, they too had been raised under apartheid and therefore had limited experience and capacity to govern a multiracial society effectively, due to their background and the complexities such societies have. In that regard, the considerable goodwill that South Africa enjoyed in the mid-1990s would later be overshadowed by deep-seated structural challenges within its society, undermining efforts toward post-apartheid unity and cooperation, particularly among black South Africans. A culture of violence and property destruction has since continued even after the end of apartheid, leaving the ANC and the current coalition government grappling with the difficult balance between restoring law and order and maintaining political support. Such behavior is mostly directed to fellow black South Africans in what has been termed as black-on-black violence, and also manifests as crime reflecting patterns rooted in apartheid-era resistance. In more recent years, xenophobic violence has emerged, with foreign nationals from other African countries targeted and their businesses looted, incidents that began in 2008 and have recurred several times since. Public unrest has also manifested in other forms. In 2015, protests across universities over the rising cost of education led to widespread property damage, while in 2016 and 2017, communities in Vawani, Limpopo province, burned schools in response to service delivery grievances. In 2026, there was a resurgence of xenophobic attacks in South Africa, with KwaZulu province being the epicenter of such violence. All this speaks to broken societies which were engineered several decades ago to produce such outcomes. It is therefore against this backdrop that those in power today continue to face significant governance challenges, including the persistent misuse and theft of public resources across successive post-1994 administrations. Ultimately, long-standing social and behavioral issues, shaped in part by a political system that weakened family structures, cannot be resolved through legislation or political will alone. Nevertheless, difficult questions persist today regarding the legacy of apartheid and the expectations placed on the post-apartheid government, How could individuals long denied opportunity be expected to manage a complex modern economy with the same efficiency as those who came before them? How could they be expected to resist corruption when they had been excluded from material prosperity, or to feel moral accountability for such actions after being confined to the lowest tiers of society? From that perspective, apartheid can be critiqued for having fostered conditions that produced unintended and destructive consequences, much like a system that ultimately generates forces that turn against its own legacy. Although acts such as theft, fraud, and violence are often attributed to individual decision-making, the influence of a person's origins and upbringing, that is, factors that shape behavior in adulthood, cannot be overlooked. That, unfortunately, has been the boomerang effect of the apartheid system in South Africa. In summary, the legacy of apartheid for the black population of South Africa, particularly in terms of social relations, has been the emergence of generations that continue to grapple with ethical and moral direction, alongside persistent economic and social challenges. How these challenges are ultimately addressed will depend on the political choices of future generations. Current trends, however, suggest a concerning trajectory, with some younger politicians advocating for more radical forms of change. This raises the question of whether the country may require a broader reset, whatever form that might take. With that said, what are your views? Is there anything we missed? If so, please let us know in the comments section, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe. Thanks for watching.